Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the owners and of the staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to your favorite bookstore for this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose have gone back to hosting in person events along with our virtual book events, partnered events, trips, and classes, so please check our website for a full list. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. For the Q&A, please remember to step up to the microphone by the pillar right over here before asking your questions so we can not only hear and enjoy the conversation but to also ensure that it is being recorded. For those of you who want to buy copies of the books that we are featuring tonight, we are selling them right out front by the registers. We will be doing a signing after the Q&As, so if you would like to get your book signed, just please line up again by the pillar over here. And we want to remind you to please silence your cell phones so that it doesn't disturb the proceedings. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. I am honored to introduce Martha Ann Toll, Jai Chakrabarti, Ari Joskowicz, and Karen Baum Gordon to all of you today for our Holocaust Remembrance Day panel. Martha writes fiction, essays, and book reviews. Her debut novel, Three Muses, won the Petrichor Prize for Finely Crafted Fiction, and her second novel, Do It for One, is coming out in 2025. Martha brings a long career in social justice to her work covering BIPOC and women writers. She is a book reviewer and author interviewer at NPR Books, The Washington Post, The Millions, and elsewhere, and publishes short fiction and essays in a wide variety of outlets. Jai is the author of the novel A Play for the End of the World, which won the National Jewish Book Award, was the Association of Jewish Libraries Honor Book, was shortlisted for the Tagore Prize, and was longlisted for the PEN Faulkner Award. His short fiction has appeared in One Story, Electric Literature, A Public Space, Conjunctions, and Elsewhere, and has been anthologized in the O. Henry Prize Stories, the Best American Short Stories, and awarded a Pushcart Prize. Ari is a historian with a special interest in the complicated relations between different minority groups, an associate professor of Jewish Studies, European Studies, and History at Vanderbilt University. He is the author of The Modernity of Others, Jewish Anti-Catholicism in Germany and France, and the editor of Secularism in Question, Jews and Judaism in Modern Times. He also serves as the director of Vanderbilt's Max Cade Center for European and German Studies. And a graduate of Harvard College and Columbia Business School, Karen co-founded Strategic Horizons Incorporated, an executive coaching and management consulting firm. Karen is a Dallas native and now lives with her husband in Brooklyn, New York, and South Hero, Vermont. She is an active member of Brooklyn Heights Synagogue and recently served as president of the congregation. So everyone, let us all welcome Martha Ann Toll, Jai Chakrabarti, Ari Joskowicz, and Karen Baum Gordon.
Thank you so much. This is on, right? Okay. Hi, I'm Martha Toll. I can't thank you enough for being here. And I want to say thank you to Bernard for introducing us, and to Sri and Danielle for setting this event up. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to be back at Politics and Prose with such an amazing panel. We're here for a serious occasion, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we all come to this issue differently. One thing that I think about a lot is the fact that there were more than 6 million Holocausts, that there were so many people had so many different experiences, and there were so many different ways to enter it, differences in culture and language, nationality, and I think we're going to get a flavor for that today. So because these books are different books, Ari's written a amazing scholarly work. Karen has written a memoir, and Jai has written a novel. We thought we would set this up today by having them each describe their book and then read a very short excerpt so we have some context, a very short excerpt, sorry, so we have some context about where we're going. We're going to start with Ari.
Okay. Thanks so much. So this is, I'll read you a very short section from the preface, which is actually a bit of a mashup.
Okay,
I would either. Let me.
Yeah.
Is this better? Okay.
Yes.
Then let me repeat. It's from the preface, what I'm going to read, and it's it's a combination of some paragraphs. So, for much of my childhood, my 4 grandparents came to our house on Sundays. Sometimes, as we sat around my family's large dining table with coffee and cake in the afternoon, they would speak about the dark times. Their stories of the calamities they suffered in ghettos and concentration camps came without explanation because they told them to each other, Jewish survivor to Jewish survivor. I grew up as a Jew in Vienna in the 1980s at a moment of intense debate about Austrian national complicity in Nazi crimes. So these stories made intuitive sense to me as accounts of our families' and communities' origins. Yet their details were lost on me. Although my grandparents came from different places and backgrounds and faced violence at the hands of different perpetrators, the traumatic episodes they lived through blurred into a single story of gruesome things that happened in unnamed camps. Without historical context or an analytical framework, I remember the sentiment, but not the content, of most of their stories. With my grandparents long gone, deprived of the opportunity to ask them about their lives, I feel the lessons of these Sunday afternoons keenly. Empathy without knowledge is fleeting. As I reflect on my own process of learning new questions, I suspect that the issue I raise in the following pages represent a departure from what my grandparents would have considered sensible topics. In this book, I explore the relations between Jewish and Romani victims of Nazism during the Holocaust, as well as their attempts to come to terms with their parallel fates ever since. These relations were often distant, unequal, and full of hurtful misunderstandings. I don't know what my grandparents thought of Roma because I cannot recall anyone speaking of them in those Sunday afternoons. The people they would have called gypsies simply never came up. I can't say whether my grandparents did not talk about them because they didn't encounter Roma in the years of persecution and destruction, or whether they lacked a framework within which to remember and convey these experiences. Did they lack words, chronologies, and connections that would have given meaning to any interactions they might have had with Roma? Whatever the answer, their silence on this topic was not unusual. Despite the fact that Jews played an outsized role in the struggle to recognize and conserve stories of Romani suffering during the war, most Jews, including Jewish Holocaust survivors, such as my grandparents, expressed little interest in the topic. The same can be said of my other communities, scholars of the Jewish past and the Holocaust. Over the years, many Jewish scholars have written books about the Holocaust based on the lives of their ancestors. This is not one of them. My grandparents will not appear again on the following pages, because this is a book about the stories they never told.
Thank you so much. Beautiful. Karen?
So the top line of my book is that my father, at the age of 21, immigrated to this country from Frankfurt, Germany. He left behind his parents, and his sister had already immigrated to what was then Palestine. He came here, he enlisted in the American Army, he then became a naturalized citizen, and he then actually participated in the liberation of Buchenwald. Meanwhile, his parents did indeed perish in the Holocaust. They were deported from Frankfurt to the Łódź ghetto in Poland. My dad was, some of you I know knew him, he was extroverted in the world, engaged with life, very connected to community. And then At the age of 86, he attempted to take his own life. And he left a note that said, "I am a tortured soul." Thanks to modern medicine, he went on to live for 7 great years. He didn't remember that attempt. But after he passed away, I became a woman with a mission. What was that? How was he a tortured soul? What was that about? And that's really what led to my book. I didn't set out to write it. I was solving what that was. So I'm going to read you an excerpt. In the end, I had 88 letters translated. I did an enormous amount of research and made several trips to Frankfurt and to Poland. So the passage I'd like to share with you is when my dear girlfriend Lauren and I were on one of those trips, and we were in search of the second residence where my dad had lived. He lived one place for 19 years and a second place for 2 years. So we were in search of the second residence. Lauren and I then walked from Reuterweg 73 in search of Eisenachstrasse 20, where my grandparents and father had moved to in 1934. As we continued on our way in a thin veil of continuous drizzle, we juggled our cheap umbrellas and half-torn maps and struggled to read the street signs. We meandered along, marveling at the rainbow-colored rows of elegant mansions, each white, but each with a different accompanying color of trim: pink, blue, yellow, or beige. And then we stumbled upon a lush forest green blanket, the Holzhausen Park. Just on the other side of it, we entered a wide street with its breathtaking alley. A 50-foot grass carpet rolled down the middle, symmetrically lined with trees more than 100 years old. Checking the map, we realized, we are on Eisenachstrasse. Like well-preserved grand dames, Eisenachstrasse's majestic homes reflected the time and attention they had received over the years. We arrived at number 20, pale pink with 4 cherub friezes on its facade. Lauren and I puzzled over which one belonged to my grandparents, and then, seemingly out of nowhere, a drenched young woman on a bicycle approached the front gate. Well, I quickly shifted from a relaxed picture-taking mode into determined detective. In my poor German, I asked if I could accompany her to whomever was going to buzz her in. The next minute, I was chatting with a 40-something dark-haired man, handsome and slight, who not only grew up in this house, but also was the current owner. Alex Zahn, he said. Zahn, as in teeth, in German. And yes, I could come in. Upon entering, I noticed the polished mahogany banister with its countless nicks and scratches, some of them from cherished wedding bands or from sharp-edged packages they had brought up and down. As we walked upstairs to the duplex apartment, I savored each step. On the 3rd floor, I met Alex's elderly mother, who explained that she and her husband bought the house from the children of the original owners. Well, that would have been the Hermanns, from whom my grandparents had rented. We proceeded to the 4th floor. The apartment's entryway was relatively large, and the bathroom off the entryway was huge. What would have been my grandparents' quote, kitchen was now a clothing storage room. I peered out the small window in the kitchen, imagining my grandmother doing so as she cooked her grüne Soße, her green sauce. Alex then showed me the huge master bedroom with its window overlooking the allée, and then the sitting room with a desk, and I pictured my grandmother sitting at just such a desk, gazing out and writing those cherished letters to my father. Then we entered what must have been my father's bedroom. It was small, but with 2 windows, one looking out the allée and another on the air shaft. It was there that my father slept his last night, under the same roof as his parents, that he dreamt his last dreams in Frankfurt.
Thank you so much. So Jai is going to read from his first book, which is a novel called A Play for the End of the World. And this book is selling very well. Politics and Prose does not have a ton in stock at the moment, but I just want to make it really clear they can order it for anybody who needs it. Jai also has a new book of short stories out that's absolutely wonderful, that crosses cultures between America and the Bengali culture in India, called A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness. But we're going to hear Jai read from A Play for the End of the World. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you, Ari and Karen. So great to be with you all tonight. So I was born in Calcutta, India, where I grew up reading the work of Rabindranath Tagore, and much later in life, when I was living in Jerusalem, would encounter a play by Tagore that was performed in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. And the confluence of those cultures brought me to write this novel, to do the research, and to learn more about it. I'm going to read the author's note, and then I'm going to read a few paragraphs from the prologue. On July 18th, 1942, weeks before the deportations to Treblinka, the Polish-Jewish educator, medical doctor, and author Janusz Korczak staged a play at his orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto. The performance was an adaptation of a Bengali play, Dakkor, by Rabindranath Tagore. Dakkor literally means the calling house. Nowadays it's translated as the post office. Rabindranath Tagore wrote Dakkor in a village in India in 1911. A couple of years later, W.B. Yeats produced an English version. The play was then translated into many languages, and eventually a Polish copy ended up in the hands of Janusz Korczak, known to his children as Pan Doktor. The play is about a dying child living through his imagination while quarantined. Pan Doktor chose to stage the play to help his orphans reimagine ghetto life and to prepare them for what was to come. And I'll just read a couple of paragraphs from the prologue here, which is set in Warsaw, July 18th, 1942, the date of the performance. The set has been assembled, a piece of cawed wood that is to mean window, a watercolor Hannah has painted of the sun that is to mean sun, a bed they've borrowed from the boys' dorm, no easy feet dragging it up and down the stairs for each rehearsal that is to mean child's bed, wooden blocks Misha carved to mean child's toys, and 9-year-old Yarek is dressed like a boy from India, at least what they'd imagined a boy from India would look like, a pillowcase fashioned into a turban, a prayer marking on his forehead. From the dressing area, Yarek spies much of Jewish Warsaw gathered in the great room of the orphanage. Schlegel opens with a poem of which he'll remember the lines. What does it mean? Afar. How to explain the word to a child. Afterwards, the old piano is carted out and Spielmann plays Chopin. He waits behind the makeshift curtain, drinking the music in. Last night, they weren't sure if they'd be able to stage the production at all. So many of the other cast members had come down with food poisoning, no one knew from what. Maybe it was the stale eggs, someone said, or the vaccine they'd been given days earlier. All night, their stewards, Pan Doktor and Madame Stefa, tended to the children with saline drops and lime water. By morning, the worst of it passed, and he and his dearest friend Misha built the makeshift dressing area, no more than a long curtain hung from the ceiling, which he now stands behind, waiting to make his entrance.
Thank you so much. And Jai, before you close the book, would you mind reading the dedication, please?
Yes, it's for anyone who's crossed a border in search of home.
So I think that's a great jumping off point. The first thing that struck me with all of these wonderful books was the necessity for multilingualism. And so when I was I was struck by the need for and the fact that each of these books deals in several languages, and several languages are important. And when I was speaking with Ari and Jai originally, I wanted to know specifically how your fluency, in Jai's case, that would be Bengali and English. And in Ari's case, I think you are quadrilingual. Let's see if German, English, Yiddish, Hebrew. And then, did I miss one? Russian? No. Okay. But actually what we ended up talking... Okay. Do you want to tell us the other ones?
Dutch and French.
Dutch and French. Okay, so we're all put to shame here. Most Americans are monolingual, unfortunately. But actually, you talked a lot about the struggle with learning Sinti and various other versions of the Roma language, and which varied from country to country. So I think I'm going to ask both Jai and Ari to kick this question off. Jai, do you want to speak to this a little bit about how being fluent in two languages influences your writing?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I'm a native Bengali speaker, and I think the rhythm of Bengali is something that informs the way in which I approach English, the way in which I think about the ordering of sentences, and when I got the experience of studying poetry with Vijay Shishadri, he had us do this exercise that I told Ari about, where he would have us translate poetry from Polish into English. And in that class, nobody knew Polish. So this was an exercise where you really had to pause and look up every single word, try to understand the line as it was, and come to some poetic understanding of it, as well as, of course, some literal understanding. For me, in those times where I have felt most unmoored, that's when I've turned to translation and translating poets from Bengali specifically. But there's that process in which translation allows me to slow down and appreciate the context of the work when life is sort of like buzzing by too fast. And in the research for this novel, I was, of course, very vulnerable in that, I'm not a Polish speaker, and so I was having to do what I could to get what I needed from the text. So it was certainly a process of humility in that whole journey.
Thank you.
So it sounds like a long list, but it's so. First of all, the book, I should say, geographically. So I go from all the relations. I try to describe relations between Roma and Jews in the Holocaust across Hitler's Europe, basically from France all the way to Ukraine, and shooting squads, and what it meant to face them together. And then for the post-war period, I look at, basically the Cold War West, from Western Europe, the US, Israel, all the way to the present. So I felt the limitations mostly of my languages in multiple ways. Because of my limits when it comes to Eastern European languages. And then there is a very clear bias in my languages that are not coincidental. So the Western and Jewish languages basically are where I'm most at home, and that is at the core of the book itself. It's a book not just about a relationship; it's an incredibly unequal relationship, and I was constantly aware, also when it comes to languages, that I embody those biases myself, where, among other things, my access to the English language, which is where most things are published now about the Holocaust, even though the Holocaust really did not happen in English. So there's there's so many paradoxes in the language itself, and I tried to overcome them partially. You mentioned I tried to learn Vlach Romani, actually, and mostly failed, but tried. Since Romani is its own language with many varieties. I have tried to overcome these, but precisely in this project also, it reinforced what I had planned to do all along, which is write a book really about inequalities in all the things that we take for granted. And in resources, really. And one of those resources certainly is access also to languages with different status and different types of access to different types of things.
And I think we're experiencing a little bit of this, a lot of this right now in America, where we have enormous swaths of our history that were not recorded and that are germane to who we are. And one of the things you talk about is the fact that a lot of Romani culture is not written at all. It's oral tradition, which is another complexity.
Yeah, no, that is certainly a challenge. In the one can overcome, I should say. I also don't want it to be a easy cop out for why is there no, why did so few people write about it? Well, it was just hard and wasn't there. It's also the lack of investment in making in securing that history, documenting that history, and then working on it. And so for me, that part is as essential actually as the fact that yes, it is more difficult to work in these types of documents, but I should say that is true for most of the world's population, in fact, if you want to write their history. So we as historians have started to work on that bias for the written in this case, to overcome those impasses.
Thank you. So Karen, I wasn't sure whether you heard German growing up, and sort of how did you do your research, a lot of which I think was you needed access to German.
So I heard a little bit of German growing up. I'm told my parents had an accent, though I couldn't quite hear it. But they didn't speak German in the house. And I studied German for 7 years. I read Faust in German, but you don't use it, then you don't use it, you lose it. So for me, I had these 88 letters written in it's an old German script called Süderlin. Finding somebody to translate that was really difficult, really difficult. And I did find 2 people who were able to help me with it. My German is not so good that I could know if they did it accurately, but one of them was even better than the other. And the letters were censored. So what really I had to do in terms of language was have a sensitivity to the nuance of what was said. So, for example, my grandmother would say, we celebrated the Chancellor today. We went to the movies and saw a comedy. So you had to know that that was accurately translated, but her intention behind the language used was quite different, or they did the German salute. So that's how language came to play. And I had documents also for Polish documents, and that was, I befriended a survivor of the ghetto, and she was integral in my research in helping me with that.
In terms of the letters, I read a book that I read recently talked about putting the postage stamps upside down so that the reader would recognize that everything that was being written was the opposite of what was being said in the content.
Well, and it's funny you say that, Martha, because I just heard this 2 weeks ago. I wish I had the envelopes, that messages were written underneath the stamps. Who knew? That's amazing.
Thank you. So we have 3 really gifted writers here, and I want to talk about the formats that you chose to use. Jai, talk about fictionalizing this really moving story, and I think that it had been done before by, it's called The Book of Aaron by Jim Shepard. I'm not sure who came first, and they're very, very different books. I recommend both of them, but it's interesting that you came from a really different angle. So but I wonder if you could talk about the use of a novel form to tell this kind of story.
Yeah, I mean, so I didn't set out really to write historical fiction. I mean, I primarily identify as a short story writer. And then while living in Jerusalem, this was a story that I became so compelled by that I couldn't not continue the process of researching it. And as I was researching it, because of the way in which I think my mind works, it started to transform into story. And the question that I ask for any story that I might potentially write is, what is the perspective that I, with the sum of my experiences, can actually bring to bear to the story? Is it one that I should even enter into? So, from my perspective, a story that was set purely in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942, I don't think I'm the best person to write that story. but a story that is about a Bengali play traveling from India to Poland, with then reflections in New York, where I've spent most of my adult life. I felt like that was a story that I could have some entryway into. So for me, it's always this question of where am I as a writer in relationship to the story, which is not to say that we have to limit ourselves to in terms of the stories we want to write or but I do think that question is an important one to ask before committing to the process of exploration on the page.
And Karen, you talked about, I think you started yours as a novel and it turned into a memoir. Do I have that right?
Almost. In the process of attempting to solve this mystery, I kept a journal. I wrote some essays, and then I had the gift. I was talking with Jai beforehand about it. It's a longer story, but the short version is we had a neighbor who I ended up sharing with him that I had delivered a talk at our synagogue in the form of a letter to my grandparents who had perished. And he said, "Oh, I'd love to read it." And he read it and said, "You have a book inside of you." I said, "I don't think I have a book inside of me." It evolved into a book and a number of essays. But you're right, Martha, in the sense that I started writing these essays, and then I thought, oh, I think I'm going to fictionalize this. I could put in dialogue, and I could enhance this. My father went to Coney Island at one point. I could research what did he see there, and what did he encounter, and I could sort of embellish until a mentor of mine said, for the story you're writing and why you're compelled to write it, do not fictionalize this. So then I went back. So I wrote 700 pages to get to 248. But it helped. The fiction informed my nonfiction in a really great way. So
We all talk about writing our way to what we're trying to get to. Ari, your book deals with such a massive amount of material, of historical material, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your journey through that material and how you decided to organize your book.
Yeah, I mean, it's what I did, what historians do, which is mostly chronology. But in terms of organizing it. But yes, it was, I mean, these relations, there are many more relations that I could have chosen, I believe. I'm just so happy I'm on a panel with people who are also novelists, and because I thought it also, well, among other things, I thought we have very similar impetus behind many of the things we do, even though I have a very different genre ultimately that I use. But I was aware of the need of people and stories to some degree, and it's not that readers want stories. It's rather, which is sort of, you owe it to the reader. It's rather that I felt one of the master inequalities is about narrative. What is the master narrative we know? And how do many of these small stories create a master narrative? So I felt I wanted many more smaller stories too that fill up a new master narrative or a reflection on that master narrative. So the book, this is why I wanted to read the preface to you, which is a preface, but why I added also my grandparents as a present absence, if you want, in the book, which was an attempt for me to force a tone of voice to humanize it eventually. So those were the things that I struggled with beyond just managing, indeed, the material, since there is a lot to choose from also, and a lot to cut. I think as writing is cutting, really. To a large degree, so yeah, and containing it then on what is still a large book. You can see why I'm not holding it in my hand here while talking.
this makes me come to the silences that we all talk about. I think especially, this is not unique to the Jewish community, but I think many of us grew up with Holocaust victims in our family, and it was not discussed. My grandmother, who was German, I was thinking about the German words that I know are all about bad children, like ausgelassen. The children are being ausgelassen, it means they're making too much trouble and they're getting, let's see, sorry, anyway. But she would, my grandmother, who lost her brother-in-law and his wife and her niece, would always say, "Oh, that Nazi business." I mean, that was the extent of the conversation. And I think that's maybe even more than other Jewish families heard. So I want to probe those silences a little bit because you've each referenced them. And maybe, Karen, I want to ask you whether silence was part of your upbringing.
It was part of my upbringing in the sense that my mother is also from Nuremberg but came at 14, so had a very different experience. My father didn't talk a lot about it. He would answer a question if asked, but that was it until he was 75 and had triple bypass surgery. And then it was maybe a brush with his own mortality, but he then was out on the speaking circuit. I mean, he talked to the Texas state legislature. I grew up in Dallas. He was really out there, but he did not. Growing up, it was not there. However, you know how you have those old photo albums, right? The family photo albums, and they were stuffed in a cabinet. And in between those family photo albums was one album, and that had pictures from the liberation of Buchenwald. And I do remember sitting on the floor as a little girl in our den and saying, what are these? I mean, they were horrific pictures. They were unbelievable pictures. And I remember asking, I can't remember my father's answer, but again, it wasn't spoken so much. And there's a great quote from Jung who said that the greatest influence on us is not what was spoken, it was what was unspoken. And I think for me, I think that was really a big piece of this and part of the journey.
And Jai, you have a lot about really important political events in your home country, and I wondered if you could, I'm going to also assume there was some amount of silence around that and efforts to silence, in your books, efforts to silence people from protesting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. And, I mean, Karen and I were talking earlier, so my wife's grandmother, Zosha, was from Łódź, Poland, and she was liberated from Auschwitz, then via DP camp in Germany, went to Palestine, ended up in Los Angeles, where she made a really beautiful life. But she didn't talk about that experience until Steven Spielberg's team came around to do interviews, which was, I think it's kind of a very common story with survivors. And by then her children were grown, and they were for the first time learning about her story. With my own grandparents, they were refugees, so they crossed over from what is now Bangladesh into India with, it's with the cliche expression, the clothes on their back. And very similarly, it was difficult to get access to those stories. Like I had to really get them in the right moment because there was so much sensitivity there. And so when I approached these more traumatic moments in my novel, I wanted to approach it with that same sense of sensitivity as you would do when you are a listener, and also acknowledge that memory isn't singular, that oftentimes as these stories were being retold, they were being changed and reshaped. And depending on who you were telling it to, how many years from the event, you might get a narrative that transitioned. And to, acknowledge that, I think that's a kind of a holy process too, that narrative is changing and reshaping, and that's kind of how we're adjusting to some of those circumstances as well.
Ari, I think silence also plays a big part in your book.
but on so many different levels. I think. I mean, sometimes it's actually speaking in the case of my grandparents, but not hearing, I suppose, or not being capable of hearing. It's the silences that are created not through individuals. When we say memory in our culture, we often mean like common shared memory, cultural memory. Like when we are actually all drawing on that to some degree here, speaking about the Holocaust, and we have something in our mind when we do that. And the silences there, the way I describe it, are not individual individual failures. Or individual decisions or coping mechanisms. They are limits on resources, on what we know and have learned. So I've largely tried to reflect on those really in my work, I would say, as one of the overarching. So it is all about silences, but not as much indeed about those psychological pressures, perhaps, because I think my grandparents, there was, so another element of all of this is really that when people start covering the silences by answering what we think was a silence, they still don't answer all of it. So there are new silences that come when the silences are filled. And this is really the case when it comes to Jews in Roma, because the whole movement to listen to Jewish victims was an achievement. These victims who have not, they didn't talk also because people really taught them not to talk. These are not stories that are supposed to be told. Be a happy American, move on. Don't tell us about these things. So there was an achievement to listen to these stories, but as they were doing it, there was an unintended silencing there too. And just one little example of this is, actually, if you look at the history of persecution, if you look at Jews in Roma, the group among those two groups, the ones who were first incarcerated in special camps for them were Roma. Very first in 35, and then in 36, there were several municipal camps. Very different type of camp that was created by municipalities. Jews did not perceive those as camps in general. They were never, a so-called gypsy camp was not where they ever feared they would end up in, and thus didn't think that's part of a story of persecution. The revolution was people boycotting Jewish stores, there's violence against Jews, they're being fired from their jobs. That is the revolutionary new persecution that is happening here, but these type of people being put somewhere, that was just business as usual, as far as most people were concerned. It's a normalized way of dealing with certain people. So when we turned to survivors to listen to their story, when the survivors started writing history, the first historians are also survivors, really, and who they never included these stories. And we never perceived them as part of the narrative that we needed to hear. So the problem is we can't solve one silence by turning to another group's, trying to fill it. You ask one victim about filling their silence, it doesn't actually fill up the silence of another or complete that silence. And I think so we in that sense, I think the plural you asked for of memories, it's both chronological because people are actually in a sense plural in their memories, but also the experiences are so diverse that the victims talking is not actually the victims. I don't know. It needs a super plural instead of a simple plural to express really what. The also multiplicity of silences in that sense.
So in a minute, we're going to take questions. So if you would be kind enough to line up at the microphone just so we can make sure that the recording will pick up your questions, please feel free to get started. I'm going to ask another question, which I think is relevant for all of us today when in our country, I think there are all kinds of atrocities and inequities and injustices going on that we don't hear enough about, and that we find labels to not have to worry about it, like the term illegal alien, which is a really horrific term when I think about it. These are people who, like all of us in this room, and it has given, an opportunity to segregate folks trying to get into the country in terrible, terrible conditions. And there are a million examples of this. I think I'd like to go down the line and ask sort of what is the relevance of the Holocaust today? Where do we think, what is the meaning, and how do we take it forward toward justice in our society?
A light question. The relevance today, it is so, how can I say this? I think for, not to speak for you, but I think for all of us, it is so, I'm going to use the word insidious almost, the way that it is creeping into our world here and abroad when we look at Ukraine. And I feel like, you know, I talk about the America First Committee that existed way back when, or senior members of cabinet, Breckinridge Long and Cordell Hall, that were
This was Franklin Roosevelt's crack.
These were setting quotas back then for enemy aliens. I mean, now we have illegal aliens. Or the slow chipping away of rights. And here we are today. I mean, we're out there fighting for others for voting rights. So I think what we can all do is whatever it is, however we access it, whether we do it through our own sense of advocacy work or writing to senators and congressmen, or the hands-on supporting of people. But I think it is incredibly relevant, and I think it's, to me, shocking how it's a same story, slightly different version, and hopefully never the version that we know.
So I think that, you know, the Holocaust didn't happen in a day, and there were a series of incremental, as you were saying, Karen, events that happened that led to things like Kristallnacht and everything that followed. And they were rippings, tearing apart of the social fabric of democracy, of the rights of humans, of Jews, of many other peoples. And I think that the vigilance that we need is something that feels especially important in this moment, where in our country and so many other countries in the world, we are seeing a movement towards a more authoritarian state, a state that hushes the press, that hushes writers. And, you know, I loved what you were saying, Ari, earlier about, well, what are the stories that we're putting into the world? And I think it's through those stories and the choice of the stories we decide to put out into the world and the choice of the stories we read that we can kind of create a counter narrative that prevents these atrocities from happening again. So I do think that storytelling has a role in that.
I find this to be an incredibly hard question, really. So I'll answer with basically reflections of puzzlement. I mean, on the one hand, this is a book, clearly I wrote this with the understanding that this inequality is one of not recognizing one group's Holocaust as opposed to another's. So clearly I feel this is important, and I can see what happens when non-recognition you know, takes away people's not just experiences, but ability to make political claims. On the other hand, so when I teach the Holocaust, I feel there's incredible amount of lessons. I mean, so this is also my daily bread. It's one of the courses I teach as a professor, and there's so many small questions. They're not small; they're enormous. How bureaucracies work, indeed, how these sort of things happen. But at the same time, I'm also incredibly humble when it comes to a lesson. Because one thing we learned from the Holocaust really is, if you look at how people have dealt with history at the time, you learn that you cannot learn from history. That is if you look at the experiences of your grandparents, which are reflected in these letters, if you look at what victims are saying about, they are trying to learn from history all the time. And you see them failing in real time, failing to learn, which is this irony about trying to learn from the Holocaust. So I'm at the same time, I'm always reluctant to fully leave with a lesson about the present, because you can see that the futures that were based on an analysis of the pasts that were pasts then, that basically never worked out. So I feel a careful reader of history ends up with, well, something that undermines their profession, I'm afraid. But but it's nevertheless something that I think, well, needs to be said.
So I guess we'd say more questions than answers, or the older we get, the less we know, or something. I'm not sure. So please come ask some questions. Do we have questions from the audience? So I'm happy to ask more, but good. Thank you.
Karen, I have not read your book yet, but I was really moved by this. You said that it was the last night that he spent under the same roof with his parents, and that's the kind of writing that really touches me, and I think a lot of people. Can you share maybe another passage, without giving it away, from your book that is equally moving?
Yes, there's two things I would share with you without thumbing through and finding it. I know one of them is, and I want to preface this by saying I was the same age as my grandmother was when she wrote those letters. I was her age when I was having them translated, and our oldest son was the age of my father. And she wrote, "I keep your things in order, and I still make your favorite dishes." And I have to say, I got it. You know, I really got it. So I'll just stop with that.
It's beautiful. Janet and Karen have corresponded. I hope you get to meet each other personally.
Yes, thank you for helping me find my German translator.
Oh, that's who you are.
And
Oh.
yes.
Oh, I love.
And even the
this
difficult
Oh, good.
Schrift and
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, good.
This may be a little off topic or off your topic, Ari, but I couldn't resist asking you a little bit more about growing up in Austria and your perceptions of that, because I've recently looked at the memorials that have been created fairly recently, and some of them use a very passive tense in describing things. And I was in Berlin quite recently and was just blown over by how honest things were. And maybe I'm prejudiced. My parents were Viennese. My father was in Buchenwald and Dachau. I haven't seen that in the Austrians, but I haven't been there yet. But I wondered if you could just address that a bit more.
Sure. I mean, historically, Austria was much later than Germany in terms of dealing with it and being forced to deal with complicity of its population in the crimes. So Austria was annexed in March 1938 with great enthusiasm from the population, and most Austrians fought Hitler's war, like other Germans, and participated, at least to the same degree, if not more, in crimes against Jews and others, in the various special units also that were formed, including the SS. The Austrian state was in Germany. Austria was given a bit of an out, made for various reasons allowed to be an independent state. And in the Cold War, it's not just the Austrians, but the Americans too. Everybody had an interest to, well, move on. So the Austrian, so that's why I mentioned the 1980s. There were several big ruptures in what the Austrian narrative was. And the Austrian narrative was actually we were the victims. Basically taking the legal understanding of yes, we were annexed to actually mean the people of Austria were victims. And it matched some people's understanding of what they were victims of a war, right, which they had started, but still a war affected them. But the big break came in, one thing was an affair about a president who was eventually elected, wartime, who was, and another was 1988, which is the 50th anniversary of the annexation. There was another series of debates. So there were tons of debates then. And I would say things have changed. I think, I mean, Germany has a sort of world champion of reckoning. I don't know what the standards are, but by the standards of most societies, my personal take is it's still impressive how far these countries have come in creating monuments to their darkest hour in terms of their darkest crimes. And there are monuments. I mean, I don't know exactly how the texts came to be. And there is actually a new debate even about a Romani monument now in Austria as well. So to Romani victims. I mean, you asked about experiences. I can answer that too. This would be more of the Nasser narrative of how Austrians have dealt with these things. And I do think there's a new generation that is dealing with these things very differently. If there's a caveat to that, it's the same caveat as you have in most other countries where there is a backlash in the past, 10 years that we are seeing also in this country to attempts to come to terms with difficult histories. If you think of debates on slavery in this country. In that sense, I think we do have that in Austria too, but I think that is actually part of a global history of a backlash, where in general there is an understanding that you are that this is not the narrative, the old passive narrative of people have died. I don't know who did it. I don't think that is how most. I think that this is not anymore where Austria is my personal sense.
Other questions? I'm sorry, would you mind? No, it's being recorded. I don't mind. Here. You can do here. Oh.
We can give you a. Do you want our microphone?
Oh, she's well on her way.
Thank you so much. Ari, I was curious what sparked your interest in the Romani. That's really what it was.
So for me, this really comes out of teaching the Holocaust, and being aware, like actually basically all of my colleagues, I should say, that there are lacuna here, that there is something we're supposed to be teaching. It's a known unknown, and we're wondering what to do with it. And then because my previous book also dealt with the relations between two groups, I was also quite aware that, so I don't know much about this group. And it was an incredibly steep learning curve for me, I should say, in writing this book. So starting to look into that relationship, it became clear to me. So it comes out of various experiences where the only sources that actually existed, if you just typed, Google is a force of nature, right? So if you are, not just students do this, professors do this too. You try to find primary sources. You want to teach real sources, and you type in, Jews, Roma, and I did that 10 years ago, and then 5 years ago, and maybe I don't know. I didn't test it today. One of the things you would get is a diary entry from a very famous diary by Adam Chernyakov. This is a Ringelblum diary. In this case, it's by a person in the Warsaw Ghetto who was famous for burying an archive that still remains crucial for our understanding of the Holocaust in general and what happened in Warsaw Ghetto. And he had a diary entry that pretty much said the gypsies are being sent to the ghetto now, the Warsaw Ghetto. This is a curse. They're stealing, and they're not but at least they're resisting, unlike the Jews. So he actually was complicated in why he wrote that. He also was actually accusing fellow Jews of not resisting like Roma. But ultimately, this is a text that is precisely these difficult texts that I deal with in the book. They are not easy. This is not a happy relationship always. Victims do not necessarily have, do not feel a fellowship of victimhood necessarily. So this is a difficult text. It's just there without, the only comment that was there was put in by a historian at Divrei Hashem, and reprinted for the online version, which said, it's true the gypsies steal, see the diary of. And then it's Kaplan, another famous diary is there. So this was the only thing I found. And I said, this is, A, it's unacceptable. This is the only thing I can find. And B, the very footnote there, this is the history also. It's not just that I found only this. There's a whole trail from the 60s to the present, basically, from the age of this Polish Jewish survivor in Jerusalem writing a footnote to this becoming an internet phenomenon in the present. A whole history of how the relationship between Jews and Roma, it's really that relationship that shapes that history and how it reaches us. So that it's these experiences that really motivated me to write a book, not just about the Roma, but really about that relationship of people who don't know that much about each other, I should say. But nevertheless, that relationship absolutely shapes what we know about genocide we generally know very little about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I need to add something to the Roma story. Basically, I survived as a child through the Holocaust in Croatia, and there is still now a memorial, but the infamous camp of Jasenovac, and they have published a booklet about the Roma who were in Jasenovac, and I wonder whether you had seen it or whether you want to see it. I have it, and you are welcome to it. But it's amazing. But what is bothering me a little bit is the idea of thinking about the relationship of Jews and Roma, because the Jews were basically, well, at least in the world that I grew up in, and I remained in post-war Yugoslavia afterwards, and I didn't come here until 1958. So they were, it's the relationship of Jews and Roma wasn't very different from relationship of the entire environment there and the Roma. So I'm sort of having a difficult time separating the Jews out of it. So that's one thing. I do want to also say to you that my husband did a postdoc in Calcutta and always thought, unfortunately he's passed away, but he used to think of himself as a Calcutta-wala. And so I'm very India aware. Anyway, thank you all.
Yeah, sure. Yes. Thank you so much. I completely agree. I don't think so. I should say both groups have their prejudices. When Jews think about Roma, they don't think about them any differently than non-Jews do in general. There's no particular Jewish tradition of thinking about Roma beyond incredibly minor. I look at some Yiddish literature, but it's not. The stereotypes are the same. Music, fiery, a whole list. Stealing, yes. So yes.
I want to say it this way because I don't want you to get upset. But one of my favorite stories as a child, and was like all of us read it, had nothing to do with being Jewish whatsoever. And I actually have that book with me. It's all torn up, but I have it. It was called The Apprentice. It was a shoemaking apprentice. And the whole story has to do with, it's a story that I absolutely loved. And at one point, I considered translating it into English. And then I thought about what it was all about, and I stopped myself because it exactly does what we all don't want to happen. Namely, there's a totally prejudicial story about the Roma, because in this story, the child of the master shoemaker is stolen by the Roma, and she is made to work in a circus, and it's the apprentice that who is being maligned by the master, and he actually finds this Roma group and finds this child, and the child is returned, and so everybody's very happy. But the whole story is based on exactly, and we all learn this story.
No, I mean, and yeah. So I found other stories, and even so you can. But the reason that there's nevertheless an important relationship is not that Jews have any special things to say about Roma. And I should say, when Roma are anti-Semitic or have some negative ideas about Jews, it's about Jewish power or fantasies of Jewish power. Again, not distinct, nothing to do with, shared, again, cross-culturally. But rather, the reason it's nevertheless important is even though they are not specific in what they think about each other, Jews and Roma are tied together, because say you want to learn about, you go to any Holocaust archive, including here a wonderful Holocaust museum. You went to their catalog or their archive or library, and you typed in Roma or Gypsies or any equivalent term in a different language. You'd find lots of entries of testimonies, and most of those testimonies will be with Jews who said something at some point about Roma, and now it's indexed. It's all there. If you care to listen to a Romani testimony, you were likely going to be directed towards the Shoah Foundation, which is the foundation that indeed is Spielberg's foundation that created, is now at the University of Southern California, that created over 50,000 interviews with Jews, and I forgot what it was, a bit over 400 interviews with Roma. That's a small part, but it's still the largest archive of Romani testimonies. So ultimately, these Jewish institutions that also, even if they're not run by Jews, they feel they need to represent the ideas of Jewish survivors. They were often founded with a lot of help from Jewish survivors. They own the history of another group, of Roma. So even if it's not distinct, so what I'm not claiming is that Jews have anything distinct to say about Roma, but their relationship is crucial for the way they can write their history nevertheless.
Thank you. I want to give a huge shout out to Karen and Jai and Ari. Thank you so much. This has been such an interesting discussion.
Oh, I'm not a question. Don't worry about me.
No, Danielle has something she wants to and thank you, Danielle, for everything you've done.
Thank you all. This conversation has been wonderful. We can clap for them again because I didn't mean to cut them off. I just wanted to remind you all that their books are for sale behind the register.